It is the biggest U.S. criminal justice reform package in years, but is the First Step Act really enough? Today we'll look at what the new law means for U.S. prison inmates, the Kim Kardashian effect, I kid you not. Please send your thoughts and your Twitter comments via YouTube and online. Thousands of inmates in U.S. federal prisons are hoping that the First Step Act will change their lives, and the new law has already brought some real results for one man, Matthew Charles. He walked free from a prison in Kentucky on Thursday. He had been released once before after serving time as a model prisoner, yet an appeals court ordered him back to prison last year, and that's a decision widely criticized at the time. Republican Senator Mike Lee is among those hailing Charles's final release as a sign that the First Step Act is, and I'm going to quote him here, already working. Advocates for the new law say that it lives up to its name as a worthwhile first step, but can criminal justice reform be further expanded and improved in the US? Joining us to discuss this, we have Justin George. He is a Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Marshall Project. That's a non-profit journalism organization that examines the criminal justice system. Chandra Bozell-Coe is a writer and former prisoner. She is a syndicated columnist and creator of the award-winning blog Prison Diaries. She joins us from Orange, Connecticut. From Sausalito, California, we have Jessica Jackson, co-founder and national director of Cut 50, a national initiative to reduce the U.S. prison population. She was deeply involved in the effort to pass the First Step Act. And from Los Angeles, we are joined by Patrice Kahn-Cullors. She is a co-founder of Black Lives Matter and leads Dignity and Power Now. That's an organization advocating for prisoners and their families. Hello, everybody. It's really good to have you here. Guests, I want you to look here on my laptop. Trump signed sweeping criminal justice First Step Act into law. That was from the end of December. There you see the president doing that. Jessica, that moment, what did that mean to you?
Well, first, I got to say, I was standing there in the Oval Office when he signed that bill, and I was standing next to Topeka Sam and Sean Hopwood, both of whom were incarcerated in federal prison. And the moment that the president signed that bill, Sean Hopwood leaned over and he just gave us this big hug, and I think we were all three crying because we were so relieved to see a start to federal criminal justice work being done. So again, it's a first step. It's not enough. It's not everything, but this means that the ball has started rolling down the hill for the federal folks.
Sandra, somebody who's had that experience of being in prison, being incarcerated, what do you feel that the impact of this First Step Act might be?
I think the initial impact right now for people inside is hope. I know from reading various articles and talking to other people that many people who are incarcerated inside are very excited, even if they are included in some of the, what I consider unfortunate carve-outs in the bill, people who are not eligible for the earned time credit provisions of the bill. Even if it doesn't apply to them and get them out earlier, they were still very much in favor of passing this bill, as it's aptly named a first step in the direction of smart decarceration.
Justin, you tried to unpack the criminal justice system and reform as part of the Marshall Project. Headline for people trying to understand, what is this First Step Act? What would the headline be?
Well, I think the headline is that politically you have the federal government that is actually moving towards reform and rehabilitation than just punitive punishment. A lot of the states have already been taking this up, but this is sort of the first time in at least maybe a decade, certainly 6 or 7 years that the federal government is actually looking at some of these things and moving toward that direction.
So name one part of that First Step Act which you think is radical and worthwhile.
Well, a lot of it's worthwhile if you ask anybody who's affected by it. Clearly, I mean, there's a provision in there that actually makes actually allows for people who were not given relief from a sort of crack disparity reduction act that was passed several years ago. Now that is retroactive, and that applies to them, and it essentially can free many people.
Chandra, name one thing from the First Step Act which you think is worthwhile.
the hygiene supplies for incarcerated women. This has been an issue in every facility, and every incarcerated woman and formerly incarcerated woman that I've spoken with. The access to maxi pads and tampons for menstruating women. This is a first step in getting people the supplies that they need in the quantities that they need.
Jessica?
Yeah, getting rid of the third strike for folks who are in there for drug crimes. It was that they had to spend the rest of their life in prison. Now it's 25 years. 25 years is still too long, but with the time credits and good time credits, we're hoping it's shorter and that we can make more progress in the future.
Patrice, I'd love you to last for this little section because you represent dignity and power now for the families, for prisoners as well. When you're representing them and you're seeing this act, what's your take on it?
Well, I want to just say, hey, everybody who's on, and thank you so much, Al Jazeera, for hosting this conversation. I think it's incredibly important to have a nuanced conversation about legislation that gets passed at the local level, at the federal level, especially around criminalization of our communities. We're living in a moment where the president has rounded up families, mostly immigrant families, has completely criminalized these communities, and we're living in a moment where anything around ending mass incarceration is incredibly important. I think the First Step Act is not the bill that we need at this moment. There have been many groups who have spoken out against it, including our group locally, national groups like Just Leadership USA, and several other groups. And this isn't a conversation for me about personalities or people. This is actually a conversation about long-term goals and efforts. I think a few criticisms that I have is the First Step Act's relationship with the president. I think in this moment when the president has not just said terrible, dehumanizing things against communities, but has acted criminally against communities, we need to be very wary when he's willing to pass bills that in large part are going to benefit private prison companies. I think in this, the First Step Act, while there have been many groups who worked on it, and I think we can be both critical while also acknowledging many Black women who are behind this and that helped support it. I think we're able to hold that nuance, and we should. I also think we need to look a little deeply at the First Step Act and who does, in fact, doesn't benefit from it. Immigrant communities, people who are undocumented, will not get to earn good time credits. And I'm afraid when we concretize legislation in a particular way, we don't give room in the long term to undo what may be incredibly harmful.
Sure. There's so many compromises that were made with this First Step Act for it actually to be passed into law. Tracy Onye-Nacho is a journalist who brought some of these up in articles that she's been writing and also in comments that she made to us a little bit earlier. Have a listen.
Given that the First Step Act is a major legislation for prison reform in over a decade, it shows that it doesn't have significant changes to how prisons are run and how they affect those who are placed in them. It also shows that they are reinforcing prison policies that are already in place. For example, they list prison work as a rehabilitation program, which is for the benefit of different prison companies such as Core Civic, who is also endorsing the bill.
Jessica?
Yeah, so I'd like to respond because I think there's a couple, and Patrice brought this up, and I love everything Patrice does. I love Dignity and Power Now. I'm really inspired by them, but I do think we see things differently on this. First, the idea of just working with Trump in general. I am a blue Democrat, liberal from San Francisco. It was not easy for me to walk into the Trump White House. I do not agree with the majority of things that he has done. I don't agree with the messages. I was terrified when he ran his campaign talking about American carnage and applauding himself for being tough on crime. I was terrified that all the goodwill we had built up between Republicans and Democrats over the last few years on this issue was going to go to waste. And when we were invited by Jared Kushner, whose own father went to prison to come to the White House, I struggled a little bit with that decision. But I did see it as an opportunity to get in there and try and at least keep the conversation from becoming as toxic as the conversation around immigration had become, and at least save some of the positive work that we had done. What I found is that there was still room to actually be able to take this first step and to try and protect the narrative. And I think that's something really important that people don't acknowledge about the First Step Act. Through this experience, Donald Trump, again, who campaigned on American carnage, has now changed his messaging to being tough but fair, and talked about sentencing in American justice system not being fair, talked about how we treat people not being fair. That is not a small accomplishment, right? This guy could have gotten in there and just said terrible, terrible things about everybody who was in prison, made them all into Willie Horton. And instead, we were able to preserve some of the good work that had happened and change that narrative and send a strong message to other conservatives that it's okay to engage in prison and sentencing reform, even if you are a conservative and want to be seen as tough on crime. The second piece was around whether or not these were substantial enough reforms. There is a lot in here, but it's not enough. We are the first ones to say that. I'm already drafting the Second Step Act. We're already working on the next steps. And I think we're also seeing some real lead in the states as well. We have state legislators calling us from across the country saying, what can we do next? The exclusions list, because Patrice brought it up, you know, that's a problem. We fought hard against any exclusions to the time credits.
Jessica, Justin wants to jump in here.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Justin.
No, I was just going to say, I think both, you know, have a really big point here. Is that, you know, how effective is the First Step Act actually in the prisons versus the political sort of action that it took? You know, a lot of people ask me, how effective is it? Does it mean a lot? You know, I've always said, you know, if you look at it politically, it actually does. And in that, this has been at least, you know, a 6-7 year journey where both sides, you know, bipartisan groups have been trying to pass some sort of broad legislation like this for years. They tried it even under President Obama. They couldn't do it. It came up against the election. This almost failed. It went to a, you know, almost the, you know, drop dead deadline right before Christmas before something got passed. So when you look at it that way, it really is, you have to treat it like it's a first step and look at everything Patrice says is absolutely right. You have to look at the basics of it. Also, there's some things in there that affect you know, people adversely. But is this a jumping off point or not? I guess that's what we're going to have to find out at the next Congress.
Well, I think it's not necessarily whether it's a jumping off point. I think that there's potential, and I agree with what everyone said so far, but there's potential for Trump to actually undo any good that is going to come and has come from this bill. For one, federal prisons have been severely understaffed for a while. Now, with the government shutdown, those severely understaffed prisons, the workers inside aren't being paid. This is causing a lot of problems, as it's appeared in popular media in the past couple of days. His use of and reliance on private prisons is also problematic, as Patrice pointed out. So this is a first step, but it's way too easy when we're working with this administration to take a step back and undo anything that is good. So I think that's why when we really need to emphasize the fact that this is a first step, and we have to be mindful moving forward not to let other policies undo what is good about it.
It almost feels like lawmakers gave it this name because they knew there was going to be so much criticism about what this act actually meant. Patrice, I have this comment, this tweet for you from Baron Mater. Concern regarding the First Step Act. Only people incarcerated for crimes classified as non-violent are eligible for earned time credits. That means that if you're well behaved during your each year, you get a certain amount of days taken off your sentence. I continue with the tweet. All people who program hard, work hard, clearly demonstrate good conduct, rehabilitation, low public safety risk should be eligible. People can and do change. Patrice?
I absolutely agree. I think, you know, part of the debate around legislation, if we could remember the early days of Black Lives Matter, not that long ago, many people said, well, what do you stand for? What are your policies? And we would argue you can get rid of certain policies or add certain policies, but the culture that we live in is a place in which we really need to be challenging. I think when we're developing new policies, we have to realize how those policies relate to culture. And so there's a huge debate in the criminal justice reform community around nonviolent and violent offenders, and who deserves to be released and who doesn't deserve to be released. And what we're seeing in the trend around legislation as we harp on the nonviolent offenders and then people who cause violent crimes, sometimes they were young people, sometimes we look at Centoya Brown, right, trying to save their lives, and they don't get seen as redeemable. And so to me, this conversation, yes, it's about the legislation and about the policy. And I want to remind, the listeners and people, the other panelists, I believe in legislation. I'm not someone who doesn't, but I am very weary of legislation that is maybe good for the short term for a few people. In this case, less than 3% of the federal prison population will be able to utilize this legislation. I'm worried about what happens in the long term, what happens 100 years from now. I hear that folks are working on the Second Step Act, and I'm hoping that many groups who are excluded can be a part of developing the new legislation, because I think we have to look at what our legislations that we create now will impact 100 years from now. That's the way I think, and I'm wondering how people would respond to slavery, right? If they knew that the 13th Amendment would create a new prison system, right? So we make these compromises now, but what impact do they have 50, 100 years from now? And that to me is, it's more philosophical, but I think it's important that we have those philosophical debates as well.
And we've discussed this on the stream before, but the 13th Amendment abolishes all kind of slavery, apart from if you're incarcerated. Justin, and then I'll go back to Jessica. Justin, just very quickly, go ahead.
Just really quickly, addressing obviously what Patrice says, a point of this is that, what is this, violent crime that hasn't been defined yet? You have the federal prisons now, everybody's talking about nonviolent drug offenders. At a certain point, you have to start looking at, a lot of nonviolent drug offenders, and a lot of those cases are being addressed, but what constitutes a violent crime? What constitutes a second chance for those? Is it holding a gun? Is it possessing a gun? What is it? And in the First Step Act, there was a lot of things, sort of concessions that were made that actually, put more restrictions on people who, may have been convicted of a crime of violence. So that's a key thing to look forward to when you're addressing the federal prison system and mass incarceration, is at what point are you really going to look at what is violence?
Femi?
So I just wanted to jump in here and say a couple of things. One, I come to this issue as somebody whose husband went to prison. I care deeply about the people who are inside. I also represented men and women who are on death row. So I know a lot about the detriment of the distinction between nonviolent and violent. But I want to make sure that I correct the record so that viewers know what this bill really is. Patrice, you said that only 3% of the federal prison population would benefit from this bill, and that's just not true. The truth is that 100% of the people who are being sentenced under the safety valve are going to benefit. 100% of the people who are in there for the Fair Sentencing Act are going to receive that retroactively. It has the reduced mandatory minimums. It's got the 924C gun stacking changes. It's got the good time credit fix, which applies to everybody. It benefits all the women inside. It benefits people who are in there who are elderly and ill through the compassionate care program. And then of everybody who is eligible for time credits, which is the time that people earn for doing programming, not the good time credits, which everybody is eligible for, but the time credits, there are 186,000 people who are in federal prison. 96,709 of them are eligible for the time credits. Of those who are eligible, 37.2% of them are African American, 35.7% of them are Hispanic, 24.4%
Jessica, make your point quicker, because Chandra, who's been in prison, also wants to add to this. Go ahead.
Narrative that this doesn't actually help everybody, and I think there are a lot of things in it that do.
Chandra.
Yes, thanks, Femi. I just wanted to say, as the one person here who's actually been in prison, that I think that this nonviolent-violent distinction is largely mythological, in the sense of, I know these people. I know women and live with women who are labeled as violent and those who are labeled as nonviolent, and I can actually say this should be a banner statement, but I would be more comfortable letting the women who I know who have violent convictions on their record out than I would a number of the people who are in and out consistently for nonviolent crimes, such as shoplifting or other crimes. So this mascot of the criminal justice reform movement, that this nonviolent drug offender, which is actually a minority, should not be leading us. I mean, there are people who have taken many bad steps, made huge errors, and committed sometimes unconscionable crimes, but they have reformed themselves. Often they were crimes of passion, and they are perfectly safe to be let out and to interact with everyone in society. It's the people who keep reoffending, and again, that's a small number, but still in nonviolent ways, that are the problem. I have a very good friend who is labeled a violent offender who handed a note to a bank teller in a bank robbery. That's all she wielded was a piece of paper, not a gun, not a weapon, nothing like that. So we have to really be mindful of what this dichotomy of nonviolent and violent really means for policymaking, and really listen also to the people who are affected by these policies and know the men and women who are bearing these labels and what they're really about.
Let me just bring in Steve Wasserman, because you would be interested to hear what people who are attorneys, people who are in the legal system think of this now law. Have a listen to Stephen.
The National Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys has concerns about the First Step Act in that it's based on the conflation of federal and state prison systems, most notably the size of each of those systems. We believe there are serious problems with the state anti-recidivism programs upon which the First Step Act is based, and we believe ultimately that this legislation will threaten public safety, increase recidivism, and not achieve the objectives.
Justin, you must hear so many but about this First Step Act. This idea that it's not going to help prisoners in the long run. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I just go back to what some legislators say that support it. And of them all, Mike Lee, a Republican senator from Utah, a former federal prosecutor, said, we can either have a society where, you are going to be safe by incarcerating people forever. If you commit a crime and you incarcerate them, the chances of them reoffending is zero. But is that the kind of society we want? You're essentially throwing away a lot of people who deserve second chances, who have a lot to offer the society. And, that's the steps that, Congress wants to take here.
Sure. Patrice, I never thought that I would be sharing TMZ headlines on the stream, but here we are. I mentioned Kim Kardashian a little bit earlier. Dubbed the princess of prison reform, inmates sending her letters by the thousands. I suspect even some of the families that you are representing, this is not a real picture, this is a mock-up. But what is real is her standing here next to President Trump. And then another story about Citonia Brown, granted clemency, Kim Kardashian involved in that. And another one, mission accomplished, where have we heard that before? Alice Johnson freed. Do you feel that this is an age where we have more empathy for prison families and prisoners? Is that what's driving this idea that we need criminal justice reform, even if people don't like the First Step Act, that people are thinking about prisoners now?
Yeah, I think we have what we're seeing sort of Kim Kardashian's role has largely to do with the rise of mass incarceration being a popular conversation. And that has so much to do with organizers, on-the-ground organizers who for decades have been fighting to save the lives of their loved ones, have been fighting to get free out of cages. I think in some ways, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, popularized the conversation, gave more room to those of us who are already fighting for criminal justice reform to have a conversation that wasn't in the shadows. When I grew up, when my father was in prison and my brother was in prison, we didn't talk about it. It wasn't a public conversation. It was shameful. And so we're now in a moment where people are allowed to have redemption. And I think while it's incredibly important, like someone Kim Kardashian is on the front lines, really fighting for folks, we can't deny how many people, especially Black women, have been on the front lines for so many years fighting for their loved ones. Right. And want
and
to make
that's
sure
what we're going to
that
wrap up. Yeah, and you just did that. Thank you very much, guest. Let me just share this tweet from Ames Grawett. She says that you can see in President Trump's own remarks, he used to be skeptical of reform, but came to believe it was urgent. And then live from YouTube, on his crystal ball, non-violent offenders deserve a second chance at life. Thank you, guests, for joining us on today's episode of The Stream. You will find The Stream always at AJ Stream on Twitter. Take care, everybody. See you next time.